Let me just take a brief moment for a disclaimer. You know, everybody makes disclaimers these days. They say, I sit on this board or that board, I'm associated with this organization, therefore you must take everything I say with a grain of salt. Well, what I've discovered in recent years is that it's very difficult to speak to a large group of people nowadays without offending someone. Have you noticed that? You know, when I was a kid growing up, they used to have a saying, I doubt you guys know this saying, but it was, sticks and stones break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Do young people know that anymore? I don't think so. Because now people walk around with their feelings on their shoulders, waiting for somebody to say something. Did you hear that? And then they can't hear anything else you say. You know, I was talking to a group one time about the difference between a human brain and a dog's brain. And a man got offended. He said, you can't talk about dogs like that. And then I was talking to a group about how the fashion industry has gotten the young ladies to think they're supposed to be so skinny. They look like they escaped from a concentration camp. And, you know, a Jewish man got offended, you know. He said, you can't mention concentration camps. He said, that's way too sensitive. It would be as if I said something to you about slavery. I said, you can talk about slavery all you want, it doesn't bother me. But, you know, some people just choose to get offended. So this is my disclaimer. It is not my intention this morning to offend anyone. And if anyone is offended, too bad. Because I got to tell you, I do not believe in political correctness. And in fact, I believe that it is a highly destructive force that is threatening to destroy our nation. Well, at any rate, there I was. You know, I wanted to be a doctor, but I wasn't a particularly good student. You know, my parents got divorced early on, and my mother only had a third grade education. She worked very hard, 2 or 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning other people's houses because she didn't want to be on welfare. Because she was very observant, and she noticed no one she ever saw go on welfare came off of it. And so she didn't want to go on it in the first place. And she had a very difficult life. Discovered, you know, after getting married at age 13 and moving to Tennessee with her husband to Detroit, some years later she discovered he was a bigamist. And I remember telling that story at the University of Utah at graduation. Nobody thought it was that strange. But see, that probably offended somebody. But you know, with all the things that happened in her life, she never felt sorry for herself. And I think that was a good thing. The problem is she never felt sorry for us either. So there was never any excuse we could give that was good enough. She would always say, do you have a brain? And if the answer to that was yes, then she would say, well, it really doesn't matter what John or Mary or Susan or Robert or anybody else did. You could have thought your way out of it. And you know, when people don't accept your excuses, pretty soon you stop looking for excuses and you start looking for solutions. And I think it makes all the difference in the world. Well, at any rate, you know, I was a terrible student, probably the worst student you can ever imagine. In fact, my nickname was Dummy. That's what everybody called me. And they enjoyed the fact that I was in the classroom, though. And the reason is because I was what's called the safety net. You never had to worry about getting the lowest mark on a test as long as I was there. And, you know, I just kind of gave up on myself. I really didn't think that I was very smart. And fortunately, my mother would not give up. She said we could only watch 2 or 3 TV programs during the week, and with all that spare time, we had to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. You know, she put little check marks and highlights and underlines and stuff, and we thought she was reading them, but she wasn't. But, you know, I hated it. Everybody else was outside having fun. But, you know, after a few weeks, I actually began to enjoy reading those books because we were desperately poor. But it didn't cost anything to get a book out of the library. And between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere. I could be anybody. I could do anything. I began to imagine myself in laboratories conducting experiments and looking through telescopes and discovering new galaxies and microscopes, microcosms. And I began to know things that nobody else knew. And I started reading about animals and then plants and then rocks. And pretty soon I could identify virtually any rock, tell you where it came from, how it was formed. Still in the 5th grade, still a dummy. And one day the science teacher walked in and he held up a big black shiny rock. He says, "Can anybody tell me what this is?" Up went my hand. Everybody turned around. They couldn't believe it. Carson's got his hand up. Oh, this is going to be good. They were ready. And the teacher was so shocked. And he said, "Benjamin?" I said, "Mr. Jake? That's obsidian." And there was silence in the room because it sounded good. Nobody knew whether it was right or wrong. They didn't know whether they should be laughing or whether they should be impressed. And finally, Mr. Jake broke the silence. He said, "That's right. That is obsidian." And I said, obsidian is formed after a volcanic eruption, and the lava flows down. It hits the water. There's a supercooling process. Elements coalesce. The air forces out. The surface glazes over. They were all staring at me. They could not believe all this geological information spewing forth from the mouth of the dummy. But I was perhaps the most amazed person because it dawned on me at that moment that I was no dummy at all. I said, the reason you knew those answers is because you were reading the books. What if you read books about all your subjects? Can you imagine the effect? The fact of the matter is, I had the same brain, but just a very different outlook. And when you think about it, you think about the brain that God has given you. We were made in His image, and He's no dummy. Your brain has billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. It doesn't forget anything you've ever seen or anything you've ever heard, which is why it's important to make sure you don't put the wrong things in there, because they always will impact upon you, subconsciously and consciously. But to give you some idea of how complex your brain is, how many of you remember your birthday? Let me just see your hand. I think it's unanimous. Now, what did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question almost instantly? Well, first of all, sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to the tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which travel across the ossicles of the middle ear to the oval and round window, set up a vibratory force in the end of the lymph, mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which travel across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, ascending bilaterally up the brainstem to the lateral meniscus, to the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes to begin the auditory processing, but then to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor Jury, retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structure to the mammary bodies, back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bet cell level, coming down the corticospinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervicomedullary decussation, so you could raise your hand. Now, that's a simplified version. Now, see how many rap singers can do that. But if your brain can do all that, and you barely even have to think about it, what is your brain capable of if you actually put your mind to something? It really is quite daunting when you stop to think about it. And our nation right now is in a bit of trouble, intellectually, because people don't think. People are not knowledgeable. The founders of our nation said that our system of government could only succeed with a well-educated populace. And they said once the populace becomes ignorant, they become easily led by slick politicians, and our system of government will fail. It's a very interesting prediction that was going on there. And it wasn't always like that. In 1831, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study our nation, because Europeans were fascinated. How could a nation barely 50 years old already be competing with all the powers of Europe on virtually every level? That is unheard of. He wanted to know what was going on. In addition to studying the way the government worked, he said, let me look at their educational system. He was flabbergasted to recognize that anybody finishing the second grade was completely literate. He could go out and find a mountain man, and the guy could read the newspaper and have a political discussion with him, knew how the government worked. He'd never seen anything like that. But you know, the other thing that Alexis de Tocqueville saw that really impressed him, he said, in their public education system in America, they teach values. They teach right and wrong. They have Bibles in their classroom. And he felt that that was really the key to America's power. And the reason I bring that up to you young people is because it is so important in the world in which we live, where secularism has such a loud microphone, that you stand up for what you believe in. You can't just let them have the microphone all the time and do things the way they want. You know, we've reached a point in this nation where people hesitate to say Merry Christmas. How did we allow ourselves to get to that point? And if we continue down that pathway, the rights will be encroached upon further and further. And soon, our nation will not be recognized as a free nation. And it's going to require courage for people to stand up and be counted. You know, and people ask me all the time, you're a man of science. How can you be a man of science and a man of faith at the same time? I don't think the two are incompatible at all. You know, people say, yeah, but you actually believe in God and that He created things? You know, you can't believe that as a scientist. You know, I've had public debates, you know, with Don Johanson, the guy who discovered the missing link, Richard Dawkins, you probably know who he is, the God Delusion he wrote. And he thinks anybody of faith can't possibly be a person of science. And as we were, you know, debating evolution, I concluded by saying, okay, well, let's agree on one thing. I came from God and you came from a monkey. I said, no problem. But the fact of the matter is, you know, people who believe that, they have to believe it on faith. And I think it actually requires more faith than it takes to believe in God. You know, when you stop and you think about our solar system, how precise our solar system is. Now, you can predict 70 years hence when a comet is coming because of the incredible order that we see. And yet, they want to say there was a big bang and all of it just came perfectly into order. The same people believe in the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which says things move toward a state of disorganization. So now how can you have both? And they say, well, you have to integrate into that probability theory. You see, if you have enough explosions over a long enough period of time, eventually one of them will be the perfect explosion and you'll have a perfect universe. And I said, so you're telling me that if I blow a hurricane through a junkyard enough times, eventually at the end of one of those hurricanes there'll be a 747 fully loaded and ready to fly? Well, we don't understand everything. And I say, I don't think you understand anything, but the fact of the matter is, you're perfectly welcome to that opinion. But just remember, that is your religion. That is what you believe by faith, just like I choose to believe in God by faith. So don't allow anybody to denigrate your faith just because they claim to be a scientist, because I can guarantee you there are a lot of arguments against what they believe.